I'm going to give a little disclaimer that this first portion is a joke. We've got little ones, so don't want to confuse them. A little boy and his mother, shopping for Easter candies and decorations, ran into their minister at the store. Mom and Reverend exchanged a little chit-chat. Then the Reverend looked at little Johnny and asked, "So, what are you up to today?" "Oh," Johnny said, "we're getting ready for Easter." Seeing a pedagogical opportunity. Pedagogical is learning. The Reverend replied, "Oh, really? Hey, just what exactly is Easter anyway? Do you know what happened on Easter?" Little Johnny looked at the Reverend a little offended. "Of course I know what Easter is. It's when Jesus went to Jerusalem and he rode on a donkey and they waved palms at him." "That's right. Go on," said the Reverend. "And he got in trouble and he was beat up and yelled at and then nailed him on a cross and then he died." "Very good, Johnny. What happened next?" "Well, they put him in a tomb and they put a big rock in front of it. But 3 days later, he got raised and got out of there." "Johnny, that's great," said the Reverend, pleased to know his Sunday school program worked so well. "But that's not all," said Johnny. "Oh yeah?" said the Reverend. "What else?" "Well, the rock got rolled back, he stepped out, he looked around, and if he sees his shadow from there on out, it's 6 more weeks of winter." It does get confusing at times, all these things. Anything exposed by the light will be illuminated, and anything illuminated turns into light. That is why it is said, "Wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." That's taken from Ephesians 5, verses 13 and 14 in the Jerusalem Bible. And this is an excerpt from a recent Richard Rohr article where he talks about the resurrection. He says, "At the resurrection, Jesus was revealed as the eternal and deathless Christ in embodied form. Basically, one circumscribed body of Jesus morphed into ubiquitous light. Light is perhaps the best metaphor for Christ or God. For most of the first 6 centuries of Christianity, the moment of Jesus' resurrection was deemed unpaintable or uncarvable. The event is not even directly described as such in the New Testament. All we see are the aftermath stories, the stunned guards, seated angels, visiting women, and other resurrections. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of those who had fallen asleep were raised up." Note how the resurrection was already corporately understood in this telling verse. After the resurrection stories, more followers dared to see Jesus as the Lord, or at least as one with the Lord, understood as Son of God. One could say Jesus is gradually revealed as light, especially in the 3 accounts of the Transfiguration. Most of us, if we are listening and looking, also have such resurrection moments in the middle of our lives when the veil parts now and then. Jesus says, "Believe in the light so that you may also become children of the light," from John 12, verse 36, letting us know that we participate in the same mystery, and he is here to aid the process. In the resurrection, the single physical body of Jesus moved beyond all limits of space and time into a new notion of physicality and light, which includes all of us in its embodiment. Christians call this the glorified body, and it is similar to what Hindus and Buddhists sometimes call the subtle body. This is pictured by a halo or an aura which Catholics place around the saints to show that they already participated in one of that shared light. This is very helpful for the resurrection of Jesus. which might be better described as the Jesus universalization, a warping of time and space, if you will. Jesus was always objectively the universal Christ, but his significance for humanity and for us was made ubiquitous, personal, and attractive for those willing to meet reality through him. Many do meet divine reality without this, quote, shortcut, and we must be honest about that. And only by, quote, by the fruits you will know. People who are properly aligned with love and light, quote unquote, enlightened, will always see in holistic ways, regardless of their denomination or religion. I really love how he articulates God, the resurrected Lord, as light, and that we are all participants in embodying the light. Some people will talk about the light body that is within each of us. How do we enlighten that? Well, there's part of this also is in that first reading from the book of Acts. Accepting what is in our lives. If we can fully accept it as it is right now, well, we're on the path to enlightenment. The truth is, a lot of us will resist what is. And right now, it's pretty nice. We're in this sacred space. It's Sunday morning. The bells are chiming. Things could be worse, but here we are. And there's probably some dialogue going in our heads right now. You're deciding whether you like the sermon or not. You got other things going on, other things you're going to be doing afterwards. There's all of this that is happening. There is the isness of life. And from there, it is a good starting point for our own journey towards further enlightenment. We're not alone. The good news is that everything is all right. God is here for us. And I think the challenge is when we have these situations that anger us, to get pulled into these lesser dimensions of reality, these things that, well, can stir us to take angry action instead of living in the light, living in love. All of that is a possibility. And the other thing about this, it's a great spiritual lesson. If we are feeling angry and resentful about something, be specific about the people in your life where you actually had a connection to another person. Then you might be able to address it and talk about it and process it. That's a healthy way of addressing anything that kind of agitates us about what is in life. And I think the challenge and for everyone is the generalizations that roll up to people we've never met, probably won't meet, but we have strong opinions about who these people are collectively. And it happens to each of us. Swedenborg has some very important spiritual insight of talking about how we're supposed to take things to the Lord for forgiveness. Anything that we've done that we feel bad about, be specific. Talk about what we have done, I have done to someone else, to the planet, to a community, but it has to be specific and what we've participated in. And I roll that up to what I see as largely all these a conflation of the problems in the world that are out there. We point to things and we talk about, organizations and things that are not specific to our own connection to another human being. Bringing it back to the personal level makes all the difference. And if we're able to do that in a healthy way, guess what? It's almost magical. We get to process. We get to have a sharing of our true feelings. It can be a safe container, and hopefully there is a restoration of those relationships from there on out. I think a lot of the challenges are we don't take the time to do that. We're always too busy. We're always distracted. And if you can't do that, sometimes that's not possible, well, try and figure out, make a list. You know yourselves pretty well. Go for a long walk, go to the beach, get some exercise, take a few deep breaths. Do something to disrupt the negative energy that is within you. You can try meditation if that works for you. Just taking some deep cleansing breaths, connecting to your inner body, your light body, will bring you back to the light, back to deeper consciousness. It comes back to the isness of life. And for those of you who are Star Trek fans, you may recall a phrase used by the Borg when they plan to assimilate an alien species into their collective. Resistance is futile. Remember that? Well, if you're resisting the isness of life, that is futile as well. Only this time, it's relating back to the story of Acts, the book of Acts, bless you, about whether we're going with God or against God. And that's brought out and lifted up in the story. I mentioned this whole story about resistance. Hopefully it adds a little bit of humor to our lives, but even more important, a bit of truth. A bit of truth that we can apply to any situation in our life. There is the isness, whatever is, that we can't change. It is. Accept it, change it, or if you resist it, it'll create more conflict and pain and misery. Those are the three options available at any given moment. And if we can't change something, the next best thing, we can accept it. And those are really the sane ways of navigating life. If we're believers in God, believers and lovers of the light, that same application must be used and experienced in our own journey. Because if God has placed a situation before you, resistance is futile, as it only leads to further self-inflicting suffering. We will resist it, and guess what? What we resist will persist. It will continue. So reading from the book of Acts, so in the present case, I tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone, because if this plan or this undertaking is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. In that case, you may be even found fighting against God. In other words, if God is with us, who can be against us? And if the nature of God is love, any act of kindness and love is furthering God's work in the world in a very real way. Now I want to circle back to the New Testament reading, the message of the resurrection. It's elegant, it's simple, it's profound, and yes, challenging to put into practice, to remain in peace and to forgive. Jesus said to them, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." Notice how the power of forgiveness is underscored there. It is powerful. So is the power of belief. Thomas was not there. Even though he had been journeying, even though Jesus had told him this was going to happen, he did not believe. In fact, he said, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in the hand, put my finger on the mark of the nails and my hand on his side, I will not believe." And I think if we're going to be honest with ourselves, there's a bit of Thomas within each of us. We want to believe. Sometimes our minds will get in the way and we'll critique all those little details, those micro nuances. Well, what about this? What about that? Our minds are good, they're useful, and yet they are not the best access for belief. There is a massive blind spot in our thinking minds. That ability to see the flaws, see the doubts. And it is that tension point between our critical thinking mind and what we know to be true at a deeper aspect of ourself. that aspect of ourself that is always rooted in the unseen, rooted in God. The mind doubts, but the heart knows. On this first Sunday after the resurrection, we struggle once again with our own doubts, our belief in God presently, about Jesus, about the resurrection, about goodness in the world. We look at our world and we see this mix of beauty. We also see this mix of horror. And yet, there is divine providence. God is in there directing things, and even though we can't see it on the surface, something deeper, wiser is emerging. The Lord always directs our attention to the depths of our hearts and the mandate given to love one another. And I'll end with that gospel from John we just read. Then Jesus said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." And may the Lord add blessing to all the followers who have not seen and yet have come to believe. Amen.